Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our clients and associates on this call around the world. Before we would begin, I would like to remind everyone that this session is for you. Please feel free to ask questions. There's a chat bot at the bottom of your screens. We'll endeavor to address as many questions as possible, even though this is going to be an action-packed and busy session. Also, while many of you already consume our various intelligence feeds from our geopolitical risk division, please let us know after this call if there are any topics or regions you want us to drill down on. Reach out to us and we will work with you on focusing on those regions. As many of you know, our geopolitical risk division and our global risk monitoring divisions are always here for you and our clients around the world. Now, over to Jeremy, Sam, and Mark for what's going to be a very exciting session.
Thanks so much, Don. And I'm really excited for the discussion today. I think it's going to be, as Don noted, an action-packed hour or so that we're going to spend together with two leading experts on the region. And I'm excited to get started. So let's jump right in because there's a lot to cover. I'm going to start with introducing my friend Marc Polymeropoulos. Marc served in the CIA for 26 years. He served in both Iraq and Afghanistan and is one of the CIA's most decorated case officers. He's a regular commentator on foreign affairs and intelligence matters, and I'm honored to say that he actually was kind enough to share insights from my book, Sell Like a Spy. Hi, Marc. How are you today?
I'm great. It's an honor to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent, excellent. I'm also joined by Sam Warby, who's an expert on Iran and Gulf geopolitics and is a senior advisor to Interfor International. Hello, Sam.
Hey, Jeremy.
All right, well, let's jump in here today. I want to start with a rather kind of broad palette here to let you guys kind of set the table for all of us on where we are, because there's been so many fast-moving matters. In just the last few days, we've seen a lot happen. Busy few days with tit-for-tat strikes between Iran and Israel. There's an uneasy peace today as negotiations continue. I think we continue to hear that it's just another 2 or 3 days from the President of the United States saying over and over again that, we're about to have some sort of document formalizing a peace. I think I'll believe it when I see it. But I want to start with just inviting both of you to brief us on where we are today. Sam, if I could start with you, please.
Sure. So officially, we are 2 months into the initial ceasefire, although it's been, to your point, an uneasy peace. We've seen skirmishes around the strait between the U.S. and Iran. We've seen Iran fire projectiles at the UAE, at Kuwait and Bahrain. And then, as mentioned, over the weekend, we saw a direct exchange of fire between Iran and Israel yet again. In the meantime, Trump came out yesterday and claimed that a deal is just a few days away. The deal that's been discussed over the last few weeks seems to be mostly a ceasefire extension, or if they call it something different, it will still be a deal that is focused on reopening the Strait of Hormuz to commercial traffic, but doesn't really solve the underlying issues that provoked the conflict. So no immediate agreement on Iran's nuclear program, principally. Also worth noting that Trump has claimed many, many times now that a deal was imminent. So we're not totally sure that there's real progress there, but it certainly could happen, especially if the level of ambition around what the initial deal should achieve or that level of expectation is lowered significantly. So that said, in terms of reasons to doubt that a deal is coming, the fundamentals really haven't changed. Trump is under pressure to outdo the JCPOA. He wants a better deal than would have been offered to the U.S. before the war, which means he can't really offer significant financial relief to Iran unless there's a clear concession on the nuclear program. Iran, kind of on the opposing side, doesn't want to concede anything on the nuclear program in an initial agreement. They believe they've made real strategic gains through the war. They've proven that their strategy of attacking the Gulf states and shaking global markets is an effective means of getting the U.S. to stand down, and that they can close the Strait of Hormuz and no one can reopen it, at least not at a reasonable cost. They've shown that their regime can cohere rather than collapse, even under immense pressure. And really what they want to do is use the negotiation to cement those gains, to make sure that they're coming out of the conflict even stronger, which is a fundamental difference of opinion between Trump and Iran around where the conflict has landed them. So with all that in mind, there's complications still in the way for even an initial deal, let alone a comprehensive and conclusive one. So we could be looking at kind of an extended period here of low-grade conflict. There's differences of opinion as to whether or not the US and Iran can withstand a continuation of the status quo. Both suffer in different ways and benefit in different ways. At the same time, you see Iran and Israel jockeying to shape who will have the upper hand in the region as things end. Iran, again, feeling that it's in a position of strength, is now even pushing to keep its proxies intact, principally Hezbollah, as a kind of forward defense deterrent against Israel engaging Iran directly. And now they seem to even be willing to use their own military might to defend Hezbollah, which is not something that they've strongly considered in the past. At the same time, Israel obviously wants Hezbollah fully defeated and disarmed, which is becoming a challenge, and the US re-engaged in an objective of countering Iran, eliminating its nuclear program, ideally changing its regime's politics, etc. And alongside all of this, the Gulf states very much caught in the middle, mostly pushing for a comprehensive deal or a ceasefire, something that ends the war, which they really desperately want to happen. But at the same time, they're quite disconcerted by the kind of wishy-washiness of Trump when it comes to valuing their security, rising to their defense. In particular, over the last 2 months, where these skirmishes have continued, Iran has attacked the Gulf states and now Israel. And Trump's response has largely been that this is a hiccup in the middle of what will eventually be successful diplomacy. So I'll stop there for now and hand it off to Mark, but I think that's roughly where things stand.
Yeah, before we pass it over to Mark, I wonder, Sam, and thank you for that, if you would just be so kind as to define the JCPOA for those in the audience who might not know what it is and how it's related, I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, it's the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the original Obama-era nuclear deal that Trump opted to exit in his first term. So his decision to exit the deal was based on an opinion that it was too weak to constrain Iran, prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon. So if he were to make a deal now that granted Iran some additional benefits or rights to nuclear enrichment or anything else that made a kind of a weaker point than the original deal he exited, he will face significant criticism. And he really wants to claim a victory over Obama's legacy, which is why he's bringing him up again and again.
Doesn't sound like Trump to be seeking to claim a victory, but Mark, how does all this look to you?
So I agree with what Sam said. Not surprisingly, that was outstanding. I would only note that sometimes we kind of become fixated on this term "a deal," and it's not really a deal. What actually the U.S. and Iran are negotiating about is just an extension of the ceasefire agreement, and then an agreement to keep talking to eventually get to a deal. And so the notion that any of these kind of key issues are close to being solved, I think, is something that is very much up in the air. I mean, the way I look at this is, sometimes you're trying to kind of grade where everyone is right now. So think about this, and we can break it up between U.S. interests and Israeli interests because and some of them certainly do coincide. But I think there's four key points that we've talked about in terms of, Iran. One is, of course, the nuclear issue. So right now, are we collectively, U.S. and Israel, closer to solving the Iranian nuclear problem? The answer is no. The highly enriched uranium, the HEU, is still buried somewhere, whatever you want to call it, nuclear dust, which is kind of a silly term, but ultimately that is still there. That is a concern, and it is very clear also in my contacts with U.S. kind of military officials. I mean, there's the military option of sending in kind of U.S. special forces is certainly not something that I think we're going to see because of the risk to force and also the uncertainty of doing this in extremis. So nukes haven't been solved. Number two, what about things like Iranian ballistic missiles and drones? Well, certainly CENTCOM had that on their target list. Really considerable progress was made, but then what you saw in the media and the press, and I have no reason to discount, most of this, is that the Iranians have been able to rebuild some of this capacity. And so that key issue on kind of Iranian conventional forces, not, the Navy's been sunk, the Air Force is all destroyed, whatever. That really doesn't matter all that much. That wasn't kind of on our list. I know people, we've talked about that, or certainly the Pentagon has in their briefings, but going back to missiles and drones, still not there where we need to be. Number three is proxies. The whole notion of, and that was something that, of course, in the JCPOA was not addressed. And so this is the Iranian support to proxies. Well, frankly, their support to Hezbollah has never been stronger. They've actually trying to link the two in terms of negotiations and seem to have been relatively successful in doing so. And so that has not been solved. And then last piece, let's just talk about what President Trump said on January 13th when help is on its way. I mean, that was a statement. We can perhaps talk about it later, but a lot of us were inspired by that, but also kind of scratching our head, how is this going to happen? But the bottom line is the regime is no closer in the near term to falling. Perhaps if we had some type of economic pressure that would be sustained, or military pressure for a year or several months, but there's domestic U.S. considerations where that probably won't happen. And so the regime itself is still intact, perhaps more hardline. Sam is more of an expert on internal Iranian dynamics, but I think that he probably would agree. And the last piece is any type of agreement, and let's even call it a future deal, in which there was resolution of the nuclear issue would entail sanctions relief, financial relief for the Iranian the regime, which means they're strengthened. So I'm not sure if out of those kind of the four key things, nukes, missiles, drones, proxies, and then regime stability, if we've made enough progress on any of these. And you can kind of take a look at that report card. Now, look, I've been a lot involved in my career in a lot of conflict. War is messy and murky, and sometimes we don't get all what we want. But I think right now that report card is at best quite mixed. And that's going to be the legacy, frankly, of both the U.S. and Israel right now. If you kind of take a look at a snapshot where we are certainly not finished in this campaign. If you're looking at kind of those four key areas in terms of Iranian behavior that we were so concerned about.
Yeah, good stuff, Mark. A lot to unpack there, and we're going to return to much of what both of you initially described there. But I want to turn to what just transpired over the weekend. During hostilities between Iran and Israel, there were some notable comments from President Trump. He essentially told Israel to stand down and not respond. They still did, of course, ultimately respond, but perhaps limited their actions. How Trump told the media he spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu is rather shocking to many of us, the manner in which he spoke. But the bigger story might be the divergent goals of the U.S. and Israel. Is there daylight between the U.S. and Israel on Iran, and how do you think this will play out? Let's stick with you here first, Mark.
So probably like a lot of people on this call, I read Barack Ravid and Axios, who seems to be the Trump whisperer, and then Barack has me on WhatsApp, and so I'll kind of get advance notice if something's coming. There's a lot of discussion on the validity of everything that is passed to Ravid, but he really is for collectively all of us the key bellwether on this issue, on the delta between U.S. and Israeli interests. And going back to my career and working with the Israeli intelligence services and having, and I think there are a lot of people in the audience now who have a very good understanding of this, if not, we're practitioners as well. The one thing that the Israelis always wanted was autonomy of action. And the idea that somehow the relationship, which always has been solid, even before Trump, but has evolved into a place where a U.S. president doesn't just get an opinion, but gets an actual veto. I think that's something that Israeli national security planners would be quite concerned about. There's a lot that the U.S. has done for Israel under the Trump administration, but it was always with the notion of if you get too close, then there does tend to be a time in which the critical need for the Israelis to take action, for example, against Hezbollah on the border. This is not against Iran. This is against direct threats to the northern communities in Israel. The idea that the U.S. would have some kind of veto saying, hey, you can't hit the Dahia, you can't hit the southern suburbs of Beirut no matter what, because the Iranians have now shown that they will respond, and that then messes up Trump's peace process. And so I think there's a lot to unpack there. There also, like everything else, there are domestic considerations. I mean, I think it was Kissinger who said about Israeli politics, there's no such thing as Israeli foreign policy, there's only domestic policy. In many ways, that applies to the United States as well. And you do see, for example, Vice President Vance, in an interview that aired this morning, was very clear saying that, U.S. is going to pursue its own interests, not Israel's interests. And that was pretty stark when he said that. And so, I think there's a lot of domestic considerations also where people look to see if there's fissures between the two countries. But in some ways, that's almost natural that there is going to be. But going back to my first point, if you're an Israeli national security planner, I think the level of or how tied in Netanyahu is to Trump's kind of demands is something to be concerned. And I would imagine that this will be and is an issue for the Israeli election, which is coming up in the next several months.
Yeah, good stuff, Mark. Sam, what's your take on all this?
Yeah, so I totally agree with Mark. I will just add that the broader dynamic here of Trump kind of taking his foot off the gas in terms of deterrence in the region over the last 2 months is part of the core problem for Israel as well. Just that he's made so completely clear that he wants a deal. And when it comes to negotiating position, he seems largely open-minded. When it comes to resuming military action, he seems to be a lot less flexible. So he's successfully persuaded the Iranians that he's not going back to the war almost no matter what they do. Or at least that's how they feel. So they want to grab as much cash off the table while they can, just as with this attack. And they're kind of testing him as well to see, is he able to control Israel, which is to put a kind of positive spin on it, I guess, a means of building trust in a possible deal. If the Iranians don't believe that Trump can stop Israel from attacking them, then why would they come to a war-ending agreement with Trump? But at the same time, he is also yielding ground to Iran on a couple of key points. First and foremost, he's allowed them to link Lebanon and Hezbollah to the U.S.-Iran talks, which was something that Netanyahu fought really hard to keep separate. So now the U.S. is constraining Israel in Lebanon in order to keep U.S.-Iran talks on track, and that's a huge deal. As well, he's kind of, as I mentioned, just demonstrating a willingness to protect the talks above all else. And also he's kind of yielding, Iran. This daylight between Trump and Netanyahu is an Iranian objective in and of itself, and they are successfully expanding it. So it's never really a good day in U.S. foreign policy if you're handing Iran kind of a victory in that way.
Yeah, and let's just stick with this for a minute about negotiations. I've spoken with you both about, the way the U.S. Administration negotiates somewhat unconventional. Do you think that the usage of people like Steve Witkoff and others instead of the more kind of professional class of State Department officials has impacted how all of this has gone? Mark, what are your thoughts on the way this has happened?
I will give my mature response rather than a visceral response that I think that, while Trump has always been an unconventional president and has conducted diplomacy in an unconventional fashion, obviously via Truth Social, the use of special envoys like Steve Witkoff or even like his son-in-law Jared Kushner, I think can be quite problematic because there has been an aversion to the expertise that does lie in the U.S. government. I mean, there's a lot of really smart Iran watchers at the State Department, though the State Department has been gutted. About a quarter of the State Department is gone now since the beginning of the second Trump administration. And at CIA, where I work, there were really smart people on Iran, and you would think and hope that they would have surrounded themselves with this, but everything that I've heard is that has just recently has occurred. There are some Iran experts now who are involved, but they weren't for a long time, and I think that is really highly problematic for just so many different reasons. But in particular, if again we're talking about a JCPOA-like agreement, which was, and I'll get this wrong, Sam, correct me, several hundred pages that took 18 months to negotiate. How in the world is a one-man show of a real estate magnate going to do this? Now, there are advantages. Steve Witkoff is very close to Trump. Trump trusts him, implicitly. But I think what you've seen over the last year of the Trump administration is some really pretty critical mistakes. The Gaza 20 plus point peace plan never came to fruition because there was a lot of the points in there that a lot of us thought were not even feasible. Again, not relying on expertise. Same thing in Ukraine with all the peace plans with the Russians, Witkoff involved in that. So I worry that as we go down the line, if there is, for example, an extension of the ceasefire and an agreement to start talking, I would hope that Witkoff would rely on experts. Now, we did see that Witkoff and Kushner, I think, just visited U.S. nuclear labs the other day. That was, a lot of us said, okay, that's a good sign. A day visit might not be enough. But I do think this unconventional diplomacy, and look, I'm biased. I was a Middle East hand for the U.S. government, so I think that it is a good idea to rely on expertise.
Yeah, I think you're right. Sam, you've been following Iran negotiations for many years, not just, these recent ones. How does this look to you?
I would agree with everything Mark said, and just add that on the Iranian side, a lot of the people on their negotiating team have been involved in nuclear negotiations on behalf of
Right.
Iran for 20 years. So it's kind of a really bad balance of experience for the US. Um, and beyond that, Kushner had some pretty decent reviews for how he handled negotiations during Trump's first term. Uh, but this is a totally different beast. And to Mark's point about the nuclear angle, technical negotiations end up making up kind of the bulk of the work once there's a kind of an agreement in theory. And that's not a stage that they've arrived at. And I've seen conflicting reports about who's actually traveling with them to the talks. And there's all sorts of negotiation mechanics that seem to go wrong with Witkoff in terms of him speaking to foreign leaders alone on the phone or whatever else, and just using their translators, whatever else. There's just a long list of things that seem to be unprofessional, but it doesn't mean that things won't, that they won't land the plane at some point in some place. But are they going to get everything they want? Almost definitely not at this point.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sam. And I'm seeing we had our first question come through, which got ahead of me. I'd like to encourage all of you in the audience to go to the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen and click on that. If you have a question, put it in there. We'll do our level best to get to as many questions as we can. I still have quite a few for these guys that I want to get to, but please do put your questions in there and we'll do our best. Sam, I want to stick with you for this next question, considering that you're an Iran and Gulf expert. Of course, the Iran conflict has deeply impacted the Gulf states, the GCC. It's created new dynamics that will shape the region and each country's foreign policy for many years to come. What does the future of the Gulf look like, Sam?
It's deeply unclear.
Mhm.
The For better or for worse, a lot of these states opposed to the start of the war. A lot of them are heavily in favor of the deal uh, for lots of reasons. But at the same time, the fact that there, in all likelihood, will not be any sort of conclusive end, either diplomatically or militarily, means that they're going to have to live with a certain amount of uncertainty for a long time. There could be low-grade conflict, every 2 weeks, every 2 months, whatever, a drone flying in a direction. That's a pretty bad scenario. There could be a successful ceasefire that ends in 2 years with another confrontation. Uh, at the same time, the conflict has put them in a position where they feel as though they're more dependent on the U.S. than ever, and yet for security, and yet also that the U.S. is under delivered in terms of providing security. So there's this decision facing all of them in terms of whether or not to double down on U.S. ties, whether to hedge. And the longer that the situation extends without any sort of genuine resolution on all fronts, I think you'll see these states kind of making choices that don't necessarily align with one another. We've already seen the UAE eager to double down on ties to Israel, which is something that no other Gulf state is likely to do, with the possible exception of Bahrain. But it could go further than that. You could see Gulf states over time, in effect, forgiving Iran, reaching accommodations with them if it keeps them out of the fray. This is a region that more than anything else is eager to get back to normal. And if there's no US-led solution that makes that happen, each state will likely come up with their own way of getting there. But as I said, back to normal is the goal. We can talk more about the UAE and the business environment and what's been shaken. But they're in a really difficult position, and I'm not sure we're going to know precisely how the Gulf will look when the dust settles for a couple of years, at least.
Yeah. One other build on that, I'd like to ask you about, Mark. I'd like to get your opinion generally, but is there any scenario in which you see it as a reasonable possibility that the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia will kind of form a coalition and join the U.S. militarily if they decide that there's no hopes of getting back to normal? Because these threats to, Dubai and these other centers in the Gulf they're based on security. They're based on being able to do business there. If uncertainty is going to hang over the region for such a long time, do you think that they could eventually get exasperated enough to band together? Do they have capabilities, and is that possible?
So I think it's more likely there's going to be an opposite effect, that they're actually going to turn to other entities, because the bottom line is that Trump seems so desperate to make a deal right now, that he might do just too much and for Iran and for Iranian regime survival, in essence, then kind of showing that we're not as reliable an ally. But it's also hard to actually talk about the Gulf as a single entity. I mean, one of the most remarkable parts of this entire affair is the notion that the Israeli Defense Forces have personnel in the UAE manning air defense sites, actually shooting down Iranian incoming projectiles. I mean, that is, and by the way, people talking about that openly. Now, some in the UAE were not thrilled when Prime Minister Netanyahu talked about this, but the bottom line is that each country is going to kind of perhaps go their own route. The UAE certainly throwing their lot much more behind with the Israelis. I'm not sure Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia feels that same inclination to do so, particularly as he always has this other client or clients. He other has always entities such as the Chinese to think about. So I mean, it's hard to kind of figure out where the regional security arrangements kind of end up playing out. But I think that, and I agree with Sam in the sense that things probably are going to be different. And the real test for the United States is going to be how to manage these types of relationships, these bilateral relationships, when the dust settles. But bottom line on this, I think that it is clear that nobody in the region wants the war to resume. There's just been too much kind of financial devastation. One other quick point on this, and this is something that perhaps is worth its own webinar in and of itself, is if things fall apart and the Iranians actually end up somehow, if there is no agreement and the Iranians are kind of keep going on the pace to get a nuclear weapon, I think you're going to see some Gulf states, particularly the Saudis, very interested in doing the same. And so there's always that notion that things can really go down a path that if you're interested in kind of nuclear counterproliferation, that there's a pretty bad scenario out there.
Yeah, and the Saudis have publicly said as much, I've seen. So that's a scary scenario. I want to get back to something you guys touched upon in your kind of introductory remarks. The lost in everything we're talking about here are actually the people of Iran. The protests and the brutal violence that resulted from them was kind of something of a catalyst in February. Like you, Mark, I found the idea rousing that, help is on the way. And like you both probably, I'm pretty disappointed that the Iranian people almost seemed forgotten in the calculus of all of this. But there was hope at the beginning of the attacks on Iran in February that there might be a popular uprising, but that hasn't happened. So I want to ask both of you, what do you understand is going on in Iran? Has there been any sort of kind of the rallying around the flag effect? I've actually heard in recent days that there are small scale protests. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. But I want to invite you both to comment with Sam, you going first on the plight of the Iranian people and where things stand internally.
They are in a really bad situation, obviously. Internet is partially restored now, which means we're going to likely learn more about what happened in January. You're right that kind of even in the negotiations that were happening at the end of January, Trump had already given up on the human rights concerns or any kind of political or social reform. And as for how the conflict has landed, we're looking at an IRGC-led regime that is openly contemplating going kind of the way of North Korea, where, well, if we did build a weapon, how would we control the people? And does it matter if the economy suffers? And no, it doesn't. It's not the people are the true losers here in the case of this conflict. That's it. That's dark. I do think that it's worth, there's nothing that intelligence analysts are worse at predicting than when a regime will fall. So I just want to give a quick hopeful spin, which is that the Iranian economy was on the verge of collapse before this war. It's massively damaged by the war. The costs imposed by the military strikes are huge. And then the addition of the blockade is massively costly as well. And we don't really know how that will manifest. The assumption that because the regime is tightly controlled among a small group of people who are not sensitive to economic costs means that the regime will survive no matter what is, it's untested until it happens. So the longer, I think this is why you see the Iranian government continuing to take risks when it comes to bombing these regional states, is that they want to make the agreement for Trump more urgent. The idea that Trump could let the negotiations go on another 3 months because he sees the blockade as damaging Iran, he sees that the Gulf states and everyone else around the world are slowly getting used to the strait being closed, if not, evenly across the whole world. Uh, there's a world in which the IRGC loses leverage the longer that this negotiating phase goes on, and therefore, they want to force a decision now. And like I said, we don't know what opportunities this opens for the people, but those who oppose the regime still in a clear majority. There's not a huge opening for them to do much right now. And
Yeah.
as far as we can see, anyone from inside the power structure who could have really opposed the current direction is, dead, ostracized, under house arrest, whatever else. So, uh, but there's just a ton we don't know, from a country where the information has been so tightly controlled, decision making really, really centralized, and the internet's been shut off for most of the last 4 months, actually 6 months. Wow. So we'll learn more as time passes.
Yeah. Mark, I want to cannibalize maybe a future question I was thinking about here. I do want to hear your thoughts on anything you want to share on Iran and the people internally. I know you have strong feelings there, but you've also been in a senior official role within the US government. So, in addition to commenting on the situation within Iran and the Iranian people, put on your policymaker hat, and what would you do at the moment if you were in that seat? Would you continue the economic blockade? Because as Sam alluded to, it's causing a lot of pain, and maybe within 3 to 4 months, there might be a chance for that kind of popular uprising that is so difficult to predict. But anything you can build on there, I think we'd all appreciate.
Sure. So, I spent 26 years at CIA, and I was involved in a lot of, what we call covert action. This is supporting, peoples, indigenous groups around the world, whether it's the Syrian opposition, the Iraqi Kurds, the Afghans. And the U.S. government and our allies actually, unfortunately, have a track record of, or not a great track record. And oftentimes we betray those who we make promises to. And I'm really worried that January 13th message from President Trump, that quote, help was on its way, is something that we're all going to kind of look back on. And frankly, and I'll say this, it's my personal feeling, a little bit of shame, because I was inspired by the protests on the street. And one can only wonder, what could we have done differently? Perhaps we acted too late. There's a lot we don't know. But the bottom line is, and Sam alluded to it, is that the U.S. government and U.S. intelligence analysts also don't have a great record of predicting regimes when they fall. We got the Arab Spring essentially all wrong, and that's because it's hard. These are autocracies, they're dictatorships, they're police states, and so kind of the key things that you look for is the degree of whether or not the security services are going to fracture. And then is there a viable opposition? And you throw on top of that, in many countries, including Iran, this is a hard target for U.S. and Israeli intelligence. Sometimes we can do the fine fix and finish and kill people relatively easily. But regime change, covert action, finding viable opposition, assessing the strength of security services, it's a much different kind of beast. The question though, if I had a policy hat on, or if I was still at a senior position, I mean, there's a difference between what one could do and then what one can do in terms of politics. And so the idea of squeezing the Iranians economically over time, I think Sam in essence is right. The Iranian economy is a mess. And over time, there's a question of can they pay their security forces? There are industries that you read about in Iran that are completely fallen apart. Inflation is out of control. The problem is an agreement. If we come to an agreement, which is what President Trump wants, there's going to be an infusion of cash into the regime. And so the irony of this is that if there is actual hope for anything on the nuclear front, it's going to allow the Iranian regime probably to survive longer. And so
Right.
that's kind of the juxtaposition there, I think, where we are. And again, it's I still go back to the notion of, why I did my job for 26 years. I believe in the notion of American exceptionalism, or in the essence of promoting, economic and political liberalism and freedom for peoples. I'm just not sure we're going to live up to that in Iran. In particular, if we come to a nuclear agreement, even if that's something that we think is not going to happen in the short term, if we do, that means the regime survives, and that goes against that January 13th statement by Trump.
Right.
Jeremy,
Right.
can I add
Thank
one
you for
more
that.
thing on that?
Sure.
I'll just to totally agree with Mark. I'll say that the uh, trading the nuclear program in some way for regime survival, trading control over the Strait of Hormuz for regime survival, even trading a proxy group so that the regime can survive. That is a key purpose of all of these capabilities that Iran has developed, is such that they have things they can negotiate on before negotiating their own, the demise of their own government. We're in essence playing their game. We're very focused, as we have been for decades, on these dangerous capabilities they have and how can we reduce or eliminate those capabilities. The underlying issue has always been political, however. They don't need a really massive naval force to destabilize or even stop trade through the Strait of Hormuz. They just need the political will to do it and, a couple thousand cheap drones. So, I worry, as Mark does, about failing to address the political concerns, which go all the way to what the protesters were talking about in January, just the oppressive nature of this government. While it might seem as kind of something that can be ignored in order to focus on the real threats, the nuclear program, the proxies, the missiles, et cetera, it actually is at the core of why these threats exist. And I'm not sure that you really can fully resolve one without the other. That said, I don't know if you can resolve it all at the same time. The JCPOA, the Obama era deal, was aimed at starting with the nuclear issue and then broadening to cover more of these things over time. And maybe that was the right approach, but I'm just not sure that even that approach would be viable now. So I suppose that's kind of a diagnosis without a prescription. But
Really interesting insights from you both. Sam, I think that's a great point about negotiating certain capabilities. And it's also a really interesting point about the Iranians creating urgency because they feel the pain from this blockade. And I think there's a strong case to be made that continuing that and seeing if it could lead to an uprising is not necessarily a bad idea. Now, I'm getting a lot of questions here, which I'm not surprised about. Obviously, a huge interest in this. And I want to start threading some of those in. So I want to stay with kind of this military component and, regime change and these ideas with Iran. One person in the audience asked what seems like a rather extreme scenario. What could trigger a potential ground invasion in Iran, which seems quite far-fetched at the moment of considering Trump's political priorities. But I also just want to get a little further in the weeds with you both being so knowledgeable and coming from different perspectives. Is a more limited invasion of the coastline to, try to keep the straits open and for the Iranians to incur more pain and humiliation that way feasible at all? Does it just create kind of sitting ducks for the Iranian drones? What do you guys think? And Mark, I want to start with you, please.
So I cannot think of any scenario save a staggering loss of U.S. life. That's a carrier going down and 5,000 sailors and pilots getting killed for the U.S. ever to invade Iran. I mean, that is something that I think would be, the American people would have a very hard time. Now, if I suppose if it was such a catastrophic event like that, perhaps there would be some support for it. But and a ground invasion of Iran in order to topple the regime is going to take 500,000 U.S. forces. I mean, it's just I don't even I'm sure obviously CENTCOM plans for this, but I don't even think these scenarios are considered. I think what's more possible, but again, highly unlikely now, is that some type of U.S. Ground operation would occur along the coastline. There was lots of things in the press, and there's some more reports today about the 82nd Airborne. And would they be in some ways go in on the ground? I think again, President Trump wants absolutely nothing to do with this. I doubt in the remaining 30% of the targets that CENTCOM says still have not been hit. I think that probably that will be an air campaign if the war was to resume. But again, that the scenario of U.S. Forces on the ground, the American people are just viscerally against that. And I think that would be something that I think President Trump would undertake at extraordinary political peril, particularly before November.
Sam?
Yeah, I would agree. Even the most limited option of holding territory on the coast to, take down kind of armaments used to target shipping in the strait would mean putting troops in harm's way, as well as kind of taking over any of the islands that are used for that. So you're in suddenly even closer to Iran and without any of your, most robust air defense infrastructure once you've landed on whatever Iranian island. So I'll just add that there were rumors about kind of middle options back when the early discussions of regime change operations came up, where thoughts about the Kurds crossing the border, discussions about, now we know that the Israelis had people in Azerbaijan. So there was a little bit of a discussion of whether or not there was a plan to take and hold territory gradually, starting in the northwest and make their way to Tehran. And you know, something like that, first of all, still a crazy idea, but it's not the same as, sending 500,000 or a million troops to, pacify an entire hostile country with a lot of geographic advantage. So I just don't, I don't think Trump even wants to re-engage in a large scale air campaign, let alone, so I wouldn't really think about, is there a trigger for this, as much as, is there an option that could be put in front of him that he wouldn't immediately object to? And right now, I don't think so. There's also, Mark referenced the special forces, special operations idea to take back the HEU, the highly enriched uranium, theoretically underground. And even that, maybe it takes a week to dig it up and you just have a bunch of troops that are there, and there's 10,000 more setting a perimeter, and they're taking constant fire from Iran at the same time. There were no really good options here between kind of the air campaign and the full-scale invasion, and the latter was, I don't think, really ever strongly considered.
Yeah, and I think these are important insights. And if I can just summarize it here, because we have a lot of people in the audience that are investors, security officers with global multinationals. I can see their names on there. And so I think what we're saying is that there's a high degree of likelihood of uncertainty for probably several more years in the Gulf and a lot of shifting sands, but a lower likelihood of outright full-scale ground invasion and, a huge conflagration of military forces here. That's kind of what I'm getting from you guys. But I want to stay with the military components here for a minute, and I want to talk about what the attacks on Iran have actually achieved in terms of degrading capabilities. Obviously, the air capabilities on the Iranian side have been drastically reduced. There's air supremacy for the U.S. and Israel to operate essentially over Iran. I've understood that the Iranian Navy has destroyed much of its ballistic missile capabilities. What does that look like in your world, Mark, to start?
Well, let me just start with doing bomb damage assessment. If you don't have boots on the ground, if you don't have intelligence assets on the ground, is very difficult. And there's, what we've seen in Iran, whether it's the nuclear program or kind of the happy math from Pentagon briefings, that 70, 80, 90% of some of these capabilities have been destroyed. Then you get, a week or two later, someone leaks an intelligence report from the Defense Intelligence Agency saying, actually, that's not true. And so I think that, there are some unknowns. But the bottom line is that the Iranians still have capabilities. And, just think of it almost in the sense of, we're looking at Iran in terms of the Navy, the Air Force. That doesn't matter. The IRGC still has small fast boats that can inflict damage. But think of it in almost asymmetric warfare. If the Iranians still have the ability, and they do, to launch drones in rather large numbers, that's a huge problem, not only for the United States and for the current campaign, but also for the Gulf in the future. And so, yes, we of course have degraded the Iranian military and their capabilities, but just like to make statements that have been made by the administration, some of them seem quite exaggerated. And at the end of the day, the Iranian military and its asymmetric capabilities still pose a very significant threat. And if it didn't, you would see, you would see a far different picture. But, there is a massive reluctance to put, as we talked about, at the 82nd, any other forces on the ground and the coast or some of the islands because of those capabilities. The Iranians certainly still have them. And so, in terms of kind of the geostrategic piece of this, Iran is still absolutely a threat, and it goes back to those four core fundamentals of Iranians' behavior and capabilities that we cared about. Ballistic missiles and drones still has not been taken care of enough. Has been certainly, there's effects on it. They've been actioned. But I would be if you go back and take a look at some of the DoD projections, I think they've turned to be false. And the other point too is, don't forget, we've had now, how long has the ceasefire gone on? The Iranians have had time to regenerate, to buy more, without U.S. kind of and Israeli kind of pounding strikes. And so even the ceasefire has certainly caused an advantage for them.
Yeah. Sam, I want to invite you to comment on all of that as well, but I wonder if you would also speak to us about the current state of Iranian leadership. We of course haven't seen the supreme leader at all, who's running Iran, and if you could share some thoughts on that, as well as anything you want to build on with what Mark said about capability is degraded.
Sure. Just first on the capabilities point, um, the U.S. has targeted, and Israel has too, a lot of manufacturing capabilities that could drive the production of new drones and missiles, but presumably they're still getting them. And again, back to kind of the political will point. Uh, First of all, they found out that they don't actually need their Navy to disrupt shipping. They can just use drones, which when the U.S. drilled this, what if Iran closes the strait for decades that the U.S. military has been working through plans on this? The assumption was always that the IRGC fast attack boats would be essential, and now we've realized they don't even need them. So uh, again, how do you take a capability like drones, which can be regenerated cheaply and quickly, and fully eliminate it? It's not entirely possible. Um, Going to the leadership question, uh, it's a small cohort at this point of senior level IRGC and former IRGC people who have some amount of contact with the supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. Uh, and there's not a lot known about that. There have been reports about how messages are passed and who's meeting with him directly, how injured he is. There's almost certainly misconceptions among those reports, and it might be a while before anyone sees him in person, if ever again. But the bottom line is that seems to be a pretty well aligned group of senior level IRGC along with Mojtaba who are leading this, and there aren't no differences of opinion, but I think there's probably some understanding that those differences need to be kept under the surface for now. That they're kind of in crunch time to extract concessions from the U.S. or to get out of this conflict alive or whatever it is. So even you could talk about how Ghalibaf, who was at first kind of seen as the lead negotiator, he's the parliamentary speaker of Iran and a former Tehran mayor, presidential candidate, and IRGC commander. Some thought that he might be a slightly different character from the rest of the active IRGC people. He certainly is. He has a different constituency in the country to some degree, and yes, he has economic interests in a way that others maybe do not. But there's no real evidence that they have significantly different objectives. If anything, though, it does seem as though those who are active IRGC commanders like Vahidi are quite more less eager for a deal if that deal doesn't give them what they want. Whereas someone like Ghalibaf might be more interested in getting to the maximum economic concession from the U.S. in exchange for a deal. So there's small differences, but no evidence that those differences are driving any sort of fractures.
Thank you, Sam. I'm getting a ton of questions here because this is extremely interesting. I'm trying to kind of thread them into some existing ones, but I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. Please ask any other questions you have, and apologies if we don't get to them. But I do want to touch upon an area that, Mark, that you know very well, the Kurds, who, have historically had their hopes dashed quite a bit by the U.S. government, and you've been there in the trenches with them, Mark. So can you talk a little bit about how we should think about the Kurds here, the role that they were potentially going to play, according to speculation and leaks, and if there's anything for them in the future? And I'd love to hear from you both on Turkey, which I think lurks in the background here as a really important geopolitical player that we're not hearing as much from. So, Mark, I'll start with you.
Oh, the poor Kurds. A group that I lived with them up in the mountains in December of 2002, before we went into to Iraq. This is these are groups, and to say the Kurds, of course, there's many different groups there, but the Iraqi Kurds are have been betrayed by basically all sides in the region: the U.S., the Iranians, the Israelis. The Turks go on and on and on. But ultimately, where I mean, the Kurds are important because of geography. Also because they've had actually relations with us and the Israelis as well. It is certainly a window into Iran. I remember looking into Iran from our team house. But ultimately, this all kind of falls into this covert action plan, which the Israelis seem to have cooked up, in which they would try to reinstall the old Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and then kind of try to then at the same time foment an uprising with the Iranian Kurds, via the Kurds in Iraq. And President Trump has even talked about how we or the Israelis or both, it looks like the US, in fact, passed weapons to the Kurds, who then, in the words of Trump, kept it, stole them all. Um, I smile only in the sense of, we all kind of scratched our head when we heard this, just because this seems to be a bit of a bad grade B movie because, and Sam can jump into this more, but Iran is such this multi-ethnic melting pot. The idea that the Kurds were going to kind of roll across Iran and foment an invasion, I don't know if those living in Tehran, even amongst the opposition, would be supportive of this. The Kurds are also a group that we seem to have always kind of go to for any kind of issue we had, whether it's with Syria or with Iran. But ultimately, where I think this stands now is the Kurds really want nothing to do with any of this. And again, if you believe the reports in the press, when this plan ultimately came to the attention of the government of Turkey, Turkish President Erdogan, he called Trump, and everything kind of went astray at this point as well. I would only say that using the Kurds in any type of covert action plan as the covert action plan to destabilize the Iranian regime is probably a fool's errand. You have to look at really what is the Iranian opposition inside, and in particular in Tehran. I'm not sure the Kurds are kind of that solution, but it does go to show, there's a lot more to this story too, because this has to do with a lot of the intra-U.S. Israeli dynamics and how this plan hatched up by Mossad. David Barnea, the then Mossad director who just finished his 5-year term, briefed this to the U.S. and in some fashion the U.S. seems to have acquiesced at some point, even though other reports talked about how CIA Director Ratcliffe and others thought it was a bit extreme. But the Kurds always kind of rear their head in this in some fashion, and I just always kind of shake my head just the notion of please leave this group alone. The last thing, by the way, the Kurds want is for anything to kick off and then to have it not work, and the Iranians then retaliate against them,
Right.
which is what has happened for absolutely decades. Whenever there's some kind of ill-conceived plan like that.
Got it. Well, Sam, over to you. And I do want to preserve a couple minutes because we are looking at kind of the finish line ahead of us here. But I'd love to get your views on the Kurds and Turkey and then try to squeeze in as many rapid fire questions I could ask you guys.
Sure. I'll just add on the Kurds that Mark mentioned this has happened a lot to them. I'll add that it's happened to them in the last year in Iran, where it was the success of the U.S.-Israeli war last June. It was kind of proven that there was such high penetration of Israeli intelligence into Iran that there was a crackdown following that, as there was a crackdown following the protests. And anytime the Iranian government cracks down on opposition, they go to Kurdish towns and villages and take people. So it's they've already faced this, and I can't imagine how much worse it got. Although supposedly the Iranian Kurds they were working with were based in Iraq. So, but I have to imagine that the Iranian government has gone in and persecuted some Kurds in response to this report already. As for Turkey, they're in a position where their rivals and adversaries in the region are fighting each other. Iran and Israel. So I think they can, to some degree, pick their moments. While everyone else is getting weaker, and they can have influence with Trump. Chime in once every few weeks, occasionally contribute positively to the mediation process between the U.S. and Iran, and they'll get kind of an outsized benefit in Trump's eyes or in the eyes of the world when as a demonstration of influence, just because everyone else in their world has such a clear vested interest in this and is taking fire. That obviously fits with Erdogan's broader plan of being, wanting to be a bigger regional influence, wanting to be kind of seen as a lead advocate for Palestinians. Iran losing any power in that world is not bad for them, by the way. So, I think they're being opportunistic, and they've been fairly successful to the extent that the story about Erdogan calling off Trump's use of the Kurds in Iran is true. That's a pretty major win. It averts Kurdish groups across multiple borders having a lot of weapons. It puts as well kind of prevents a possible refugee crisis that could affect Turkey as well. Iranians flowing into Turkey, although some of that did happen anyway. So I don't know. It seems as though their influence is growing. I don't know that it's exploding. There's been it's been a little bit more measured the way they've kind of handled the situation than I would have expected.
Got it. Thanks so much for that. We're getting towards the finish line here, so I'm going to give you guys a quick one. I might hunt in the questions that we have to see if there's another quick one because I do think it's good to get people done by the end of the hour here. But one of the audience members asked quite a straightforward question. What do you think the odds are of getting an agreement that's as good as the JCPOA? Sam?
I mean, you'd have to specify time frame to give the bad answer, but in the next 3 weeks, like 2%, in the next 6 months, 30-40%. I'm making these up. But as you extend the time frame, if the US team has real patience, they can probably get there over time. But there's a lot of mitigating factors and scenarios that you can't really know yet about how continuing conflict in the region between multiple parties is going to evolve and what pressures, how the Iranian economy will behave. Are there going to be future rounds of strikes? But a deal better than the JCPOA also being a subjective judgment. I'm getting too deep into the caveating, but the main thing that was on the table that would have been better than the JCPOA was a full-on freeze-on enrichment versus just a cap on that prevents anything being enriched above a certain level. Theoretically that is better, but it also doesn't. There's a sunset on that cap on that freeze. So I don't know, meaningfully better. I don't see.
Got it. Mark, I'd like to ask you the same thing, but I also want to just pitch this final question over to you as well. Sam, I'll try to give you an opportunity to answer as well. I thought it was really compelling when we talked about the UAE earlier, and you referenced, Israel's support with the with military matters there. And a member of the audience was asking if we think that the UAE will be attacked again by Iran. Maybe there's some sort of unofficial agreement between the parties not to attack anymore, because we've seen attacks in Kuwait and Bahrain of late. But the UAE has been a little bit more aggressive, I believe, in its kind of rhetoric and in working with Israel. So, Mark, if you want to give a quick speculation on that question of the JCPOA and then switch to the UAE in a couple minutes, and then Sam, a quick one over to you, and we'll wrap up.
So with the JCPOA, I mean, you have to define, quote, good.
Yeah.
Again, does that mean, limits on Iranian nuclear program, which, okay, you can say that's good, but at the expense of course, keeping the regime in power. And that's what an agreement is going to entail. And then throw on top of that U.S. domestic politics. I mean, I don't know how, look, if there is going to be an agreement, there's going to be sanctions relief for the Iranians. I don't know how Trump sells that. He's certainly going to have to try, but he's going to be lambasted. And he has an enormous issue with on the right of people who have spent their careers, whether in analysis, academia, and government, lambasting the JCPOA. So, how he would sell that as well. I think you have to define what good is. In terms of the UAE, I mean, it's clear they took the brunt, of course, of the Iranian attacks, and then again, you have the IDF actually in the UAE now defending them. I guess the question is, would they get attacked by Iran if hostilities resumed? I mean, that is certainly is potential. It depends what types of hostilities. I mean, if it's a full-on U.S.-Iran assault again on Iran, I think that the Iranians certainly could strike targets in the Gulf once more. I just don't see that actually happening, just because there's such an aversion on the U.S. side to going back to any of this. But if you're a UAE national security planner, and frankly, just for the UAE overall, you can't say the security situation is going to be the same with the Dubai that we all knew and loved into the future. It might take certainly quite some time for things to recover.
Sam, any closing thoughts from you on the UAE?
Yeah, I would say if I were a UAE security planner, I would assume that they would definitely be targeted again, either during kind of one of these, cold conflict, hot peace periods, or in a period of renewed conflict. What happened over the last few days, where the exchange stayed somewhat limited between Israel and Iran, is unique to this most recent round of conflict. The UAE otherwise has consistently been targeted. and Iran has kind of the best rationale for targeting them, given the Israel relationship, and their, how central they are to global trade. So unless there's a real deal that actually ends all hostilities, I would expect that the UAE will continue to presume they'll be attacked again.
Well, thanks so much, Marc Polymeropoulos and Sam Warby. This has been a fascinating discussion. I thank everybody in the audience for joining us today who put questions in here. Look forward to being with you all again soon. We will obviously be tracking the conflict with Iran very closely as we track all geopolitical affairs, and we will do these sort of flash briefings as things arise. And of course, we'll be continuing our webinar series with interesting content for you in the future. If you have any questions, concerns, or as Don suggested, suggestions for topics, please do reach out. And of course, we're always here for you if you have any questions, concerns, or needs when it comes to intelligence or security matters. So thank you very much and wishing you all a great rest of your day.